Alright, so now it's time to go over some hand examples where we'll go into some turn play. So let's do hand example number 1, which focuses more on flop play, but the button opens and we flat in the small blind. The flop comes Jack 7-5 with a flush draw, and we donk bet King Jack of Hearts. What are the arguments for donk betting here? So once again, pause for a moment and think what are the reasons why donk betting is good here, and then resume, and then I'll tell you why I think it's good. Okay, so the reason why I like donk betting a lot here is you're usually flatting the small blind with a lot of ace jack and king jack hands. I imagine I just wrote that right here. Okay, yeah, so small blind flatting range often has ace jack and king jack and hits the small blind flatting range much harder than the garbage button opening range. So ace jack and king jack are just super good hands against the button opening range here, and it just makes a lot of sense to bet them. Let me see if I gave another reason. We can still bet club turns for value after donking the flop. Also a good reason. And we do not love giving 2 additional cards on this board texture, and check calling will guarantee the opponent gets to see 2 additional cards. So, this is a board texture especially where if my opponent's going to get to see 2 cards, he needs to pay for them. Because I don't really mind giving 1 card that much, to be honest. 1 card's like, okay, that's cool. But 2, it's like, you're going to run a runner some straights on this board, you're going to run a runner some flushes. I don't really want to deal with that, so if you are going to get to see 2 cards, you need to pay some money for that. Whereas if I check call the flop, I'm not going to be able to check raise the turn, so then you get to check back a lot of the time, and sometimes you'll outdraw me with a silly hand. So this is a board texture where I really like donk betting for these reasons. Continuing with hand example number 1, flop play. What happens if the opponent raises us? Are we made close to indifferent by calling? So pause for a moment and think. Then just resume and we'll talk about it. Does it matter if we call or fold? Does one allow us to be exploited, or should we mix it up? Once again, pause for a moment and think about it. Think back. Approximately how many bluffs did we have on the flop for each value bet? Always be aware of this. When facing raises, we usually defend bluffs on the flop, we usually defend most of our value range on the turn, and we usually fold value hands on the river when facing raises. Through the magic of editing, we've teleported into the past to a previous slide, and you can see right here, look at the price your opponent usually pays when he bluff raises. If you are folding all your bluffs on the flop, your opponent's printing money. If you're folding, all your bluffs but calling with all your value on the turn, that's about right. And if you're only folding your bluffs on the river and calling with all your value hands, your opponent's going to lose a bunch of money on his bluffs. So keep that in mind for what you need to actually be defending with in theory. In theory, on the flop, not only do you have to defend with all your value, you're going to have to call with some bluffs. You're going to have to do that whole floating out of position thing, or 3-bet bluff them, or whatever works for the specific board texture. On the turn's kind of easy. You kind of just muck all the bluffs and do whatever with all your value hands based on the board texture. And then on the river, that's also kind of why people probably hate value betting the river so thin, because when you value bet the river and your opponent raises, you have to fold value if you're playing well, if you're playing a balanced game. Whereas on the flop, it's very easy to value bet, because if your opponent raises, you're never going anywhere if your opponent's playing a balanced game. So just look at these sweet graphs that I made, or charts, whatever they're called, of figures, and then think, okay, if that's what our range looks like on each street, what price is my opponent getting on his bluff? How many bluffs do I need to defend? And then that's going to be very useful for helping you sort of play optimally against someone that's really good. We're now back to the present, and yet the opponent does not have King Jack beat very much on the flop. So even though it's very bad when a good opponent raises us here, a sweet value hand is now close to indifferent, the frequency at which it should happen should be quite low. That's what we talked about just a moment ago. Even though it sucks to get raised here, he can only do it so much before we're just like, oh man, my opponent is spewy and I am going to win a bunch of money.